Hello, and welcome to Loyola Marymount University. My name is Dennis Draper, and I'm the Dean of the College of Business Administration. Each year, we are fortunate to bring in a number of prominent business executives and special guest speakers to participate in our CBA lecture series. From high-ranking government officials, to leading journalists, to internationally acclaimed social entrepreneurs. All of our distinguished speakers share one common goal: to educate our students and local community on some of the biggest issues in global business today, all while reinforcing LMU's underlying mission of teaching business with ethics and social responsibility. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Welcome all the faculty and staff from College of Business Administration, our alumni, supporters, professionals who support our program. I appreciate your attendance. I'm also pleased to have Dr. Leiserowitz as our guest speaker talking on a very important topic. Dr. Leiserowitz is a research scientist at the Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and director of Yale Climate Change Communication and Environmental Center. He is an expert on public opinion and engagement with issues of climate change and the environment. His research investigates the psychological, cultural, political factors that influences environmental beliefs, attitude, policy support, and behavior. He conducts research on global, national, and local scales, including many surveys of American public. He also conducted the first study of worldwide public value, attitude, and behavior regarding sustainability, including environmental protection, economic prosperity, and human development. He has served as consultant to John F. Kennedy School of Government, the United Nations Development Program, the Gallup World Poll, and World Economic Forum. He's also the host of Climate Connections, a national radio program and podcast. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Leiserowitz to LMU as our speaker tonight.
Well, thank you so much, and especially thank you to Mahmoud for the invitation to come. It's such a pleasure to come. I was just explaining to the faculty, I especially appreciate the invitation, given that I live in New Haven, Connecticut, to come to sunny California. As I explained, my wife is currently digging my house out of another snowstorm. So thank you very much for the invitation to come. Looking forward to our conversation together. I'm going to quickly introduce a little bit more about who we are and what we do at the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. And really, today's topic will be climate change in the American mind. And I'll obviously talk a bit more about that in a moment. So we do two main things at my program. The first is, of course, research. We've done a whole series of national scale survey studies looking at how do Americans respond to this issue. What do they understand and misunderstand about the causes, the consequences, and the potential solutions to climate change? How do people perceive the risks? So the likelihood and the severity of different kinds of impacts, from fires to droughts to floods to impacts on human health and ecosystems and societies. What kinds of policies do people support or oppose? And what kinds of behaviors are people engaged in? Okay? And really, we look at four main types of behavior. How do people actually use and conserve energy at home and on the road? What kinds of consumer behavior are people engaged in? So will they prefer the products and services that are more environmentally friendly? But also, very interestingly, to what extent are they willing to reward or punish companies for their actions? We can think of boycotts or boycotts. And that's actually a fascinating topic. We look at social behavior. How do we talk about this issue? Or often don't talk about this issue? How does it relate in our own social networks of our friends and our family members, our workplaces? And then last but not least, we look at citizen behavior, political behavior. Not just whether people support or oppose policy, and not even just whether they support one politician versus another, but to what extent are people willing to actually get engaged as active citizens, to say, we want change. We want the political system to respond. And then ultimately, we're scientists, so our fundamental question then is why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, political reasons why some people get very engaged with these issues, lots of other people are apathetic, and others are downright dismissive or hostile? And we look at many different scales. So here I'll be mostly talking about our work in the United States. We've done a lot of work increasingly at the state and local level. For 5 years, I worked in the Arctic with Inuit Eskimo communities who are literally on the front lines of climate change, are facing forced relocation from their homes. They'll be some of the world's first climate refugees. But also increasingly international. We did the first ever national study in China, the first ever national study in India, and then with the Gallup World Poll, we've looked at this issue in about 130 countries around the world. So I'm happy in the end, in questions, to go to any scale that people are interested in. But for today, I'm really going to focus mostly on the United States. The other thing, though, we do is outreach. And in particular, we have a new national radio program that's just about 5 months old now called Climate Connections. And the goal of this radio program is to help people connect the dots between global climate change, which seems so big and abstract and complicated and distant from most of our lives, and try to bring it down home, bring it here and now, to tell the stories, to hear the voices of the people who are seeing changes in their own local environments, and more importantly, the stories of the great people who are actually solving this problem all around us, because most of us aren't aware of all the great work that's being done. The trick to this program is that each of these stories is only 90 seconds long, but they come out every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We're on in about 85 radio markets across the country currently, and hopefully, I can't remember, I think there are a couple stations in the LA area, but I would encourage you to come check us out. We're also available on iTunes and in podcast. Okay. The other thing I should really say right up front is that we, of course, can't do this work without the incredible support of our dear friends and colleagues across the country, and in particular, my good friends at the George Mason Center for Climate Change Communication, who we've done a lot of this work with, and so I'll be drawing a lot on our joint work, but of course, it's also researchers at many other universities. And then, of course, our sponsors, without which any of this would be possible. So we've gotten funding from both NOAA and NSF, but also a variety of foundations, especially here in California. Okay, so let me begin with a basic proposition. And I'll just say, it would be great, it would be wonderful, if everyone in the United States could have the equivalent of Climate Change 101. A full semester course dedicated to learning about the causes, the consequences, the solutions to climate change. Okay? All the details of how exactly the climate system works, what the various impacts are likely to be, and what are the range of options to try to solve this problem. But that's never going to happen. Never going to happen. The vast majority of people are way too busy. They have so many other things going on in their lives. They don't have the background. They don't have the training. They don't have the interest to actually take a full semester long course in all the details. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that, in fact, there aren't millions of people who do want those details. They do want answers. They are curious. They are asking for more information. And as a scientific community, we need to do all we can to go more than meet them halfway to try to answer those questions. But that's not most people. Okay? So the question is, and the challenge I would like to pose is, assume for a moment that most people have only enough room in their head enough shelf space in their mind for 5 ideas about climate change, what would you want them to know? Do they need to know all the intricate details of how the carbon cycle works? Do they need to know exactly what the parts per million of carbon dioxide concentrations are in the atmosphere? Do they need to know exactly how energy balance works? Okay. I'd argue no, and based on our research of us and our colleagues, we actually think that for all the complexity of climate change, and it is scientifically complex, we're talking about the operation of the planet, right? The interaction of the planet with the sun, and the way that the sun's rays and sun's heat interacts with the oceans and the atmosphere and the ice on this planet, as well as the land surface. This is incredibly complicated. And yet, we think that by and large, most people need to know 5 basic ideas. And those 5 ideas can be boiled down to 10 words. Now, actually, a good friend of mine has converted this into a haiku, but I won't give you that. Okay? All right, first of all, it's real. It's happening. Okay? Secondly, it's us. To extend on this a little bit, yes, of course, the climate has changed naturally over millions and even billions of years of past Earth history, of course. But this time it's different. This time it's the direct result of human activities. Third, it's bad. It's bad now, and it's going to get much worse in the future if we continue on this current path. Fourth, really importantly, scientists agree. The people who study this day in, day out for their living, the experts, have reached firm conclusions across the entire community that climate change is happening, that it is primarily human-caused, and that it's going to have a whole host of negative consequences. Okay? And I'll come back to this theme. But fifth, and not last, is that there's hope. Okay? There are solutions at hand. There are solutions being implemented. In fact, much of what we can do to solve this problem already exists around us. It's not going to require massive new breakthrough technologies, though we still need to invest in some of those things like fusion. If somebody can crack the fusion puzzle, wow, instant Nobel Prize. Okay? But that's a long shot, and it's going to take a while. And we don't have to wait. So, given this, how are we doing? Where are Americans currently on these different factors? Well, so what I'm showing you now is data from a whole series of national survey studies that we've conducted over the past decade, essentially. And really, I'm going to show you a pattern that shows up again and again across not only our own data, but everyone else that we, all of our peers, so Gallup, Pew, et cetera. And here, the data starts back in November of 2008, and this is just as of a couple months ago in the end of 2014. We're actually just about to go in the field with our latest survey, so we'll have more recent data very soon. But the key thing to note is this pattern right here, that back in 2008, 71% of Americans said that global warming is happening. But that dropped dramatically, on average 14 percentage points, from 2008 to 2010. And then it kind of burbled along, slight rise, burbled along, and now we're back up to about 66%, 2/3 of Americans. Okay. But only half of Americans understand that it's primarily human-caused, right here. Though again, there was a big drop, about 10 points, in understanding human causation in that critical period. And then coming back to what I just alluded to, only 1 in 10 Americans understands that it's more than 90% of climate scientists, in fact, most estimates have it about 97% of climate scientists are convinced, based upon the evidence, that human-caused climate change is happening. But only 1 in 10 Americans understands that. Okay? Now, that's not by accident. Now, partly it's because we in the scientific community, frankly, are lousy communicators. Okay? It's partly our fault. Because in scientific culture, when you publish something, when you say it once, you don't need to say it again. Okay? That's not the way you get rewarded. You don't get rewarded for publishing the same results again and again and again. It's always, what's the next results? What's the next results? Okay? So our just culture as scientists is not to keep repeating the facts that we already established decades ago. So partly it's our fault. But it's also because there's been a massive disinformation campaign waged over the past several decades. Okay? A mass campaign to basically confuse the public. And this is a strategy that was literally lifted chapter and verse out of the tobacco wars. If you go back into the tobacco documents, there are documents that explicitly, here is the playbook, here is the strategy, and the key thing was doubt is our product. Because the tobacco companies understood many decades ago that if you can just convince people that the science is still unsettled, okay? Doctors don't yet know, is smoking bad for you? You hear some scientists say yes, other scientists say no. We don't really know. As long as they could keep people believing that, they would still buy, smoke, and the tobacco companies would rake in billions and billions of dollars. And it was a very effective strategy. It worked for a long time. But that's actually another example of how social change can in fact happen. Because I think most of us have been alive during this incredible shift. When I grew up, smoking was everywhere. Okay? It was cool, it was glamorous, it was in film, it was in television. And now it's completely inverted. Well, that exact same strategy, including the exact same scientists who denied the connection between smoking and impacts on your health, are the same people who are now saying that climate change either isn't happening, or it's not human caused, or it's not bad for us, or that it's actually good for us. Okay? And in fact, I encourage you, there's a new movie that's about to come out on this incredible amount of research that's been done about this called Merchants of Doubt. It's going to be out, I think, in just a couple months, and I encourage you to go look at it because it's an incredible story. Okay, so that's partly what's going on. But we also see that very few Americans say they're very worried about this issue. So as of our last study just a couple months ago, only 11% of Americans said that they're very worried. Now, why is that? Well, we find a variety of reasons, but one of the most persistent ones that we've seen throughout all of these studies is that for many people, they still see climate change, even if they accept it, as a distant problem. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space. This is about polar bears, or maybe some small island countries, but not the United States, not California, not LA, not my friends and family, or any of the people and places that I care about. And so as a result, it's seen as psychologically distant. Okay? An issue that's out there, and yeah, I kind of wish somebody would do something about it, but I don't see how that connects to my life or any things that I care about, and so I don't think about it all that much. Okay? That sense of distance has been a really strong and recurrent barrier. And what that's meant is that people just don't prioritize it. And I think many of you have probably seen these kind of results before. This is data that comes from the Pew Research Center. Our own data shows the exact kind of pattern. And that is that consistently, when you ask people what are the most important national priorities for Congress and the President to work on, global warming shows up at the bottom of those lists almost every time. Okay? Well below the economy, jobs, terrorism, education, Social Security, budget deficit, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And again, since that critical high water mark in 2007, it had dropped about 9 percentage points. But so did energy as a priority, so did the environment as a broader category. Okay, so now we have another way that we get at this. It's one of my all-time favorite measures. It's a form of free association. And since I have a pretty non-representative sample of the American public here, we're going to play along. Okay? So here's the question. It's very simple. What's the first thought or image that comes to your mind when you hear the words global warming? Now, don't say anything. Okay? Now, if something came to your mind about melting ice, please raise your hand. Okay? Now look around. Keep them up high. Okay? I can tell you, I can read minds. because that's exactly what we see among the American public as well. And by the way, that little exercise we just did, it works with every room I've ever been in. Doesn't matter whether you're corporate CEOs, national security folks, faith community, climate scientists. Everybody's one of their first things that many people immediately think of is melting ice. And that's what we find here as well. Now, by the way, this data is from 2003. I'll show you more recent data in a moment. Okay, so a lot of people think of melting ice. Why is that? Well, in large part, it's because of the media. Okay? You know, think about it. A reporter does a story about global warming, and they submit their copy, and the editor says, all right, now somebody get me an image on global warming, right? And what do they always go to? Always go to is the picture of ice melting, or the polar bear stranded on the ice floe, right? How many times have you seen that icon? Okay? And television loves this stuff because you can show, you know, big chunks of ice falling off a glacier, right? And big waves. It's great television, right? And on one hand, this is actually a useful icon or a useful image. Even if you want to think of it in marketing terms, it's a brand. Because it resonates with something we all understand intuitively in our bones. If I'm to take a glass of ice water, or of ice, outside on a nice warm day, what happens? It melts. I didn't have to show you a single chart, right? I didn't have to tell you anything about how physics works. You already know that you put ice in a warm environment and it's going to melt. And so when you show people pictures of sea ice retreating on the Arctic Ocean, or ice shelves breaking off of Antarctica, or glaciers melting around the world, those incredible before and after photos that I think many of you have seen, people go, oh, that's happening. That's real. But there's also a problem with this first association. Okay? Everybody that was thinking of melting ice, can you put your hand back up? And keep it up. Keep it up. Okay, now I want you to keep your hand up if you live on the shores of the Arctic Ocean, in Antarctica, or next to a melting glacier. Really? Look how big this room is. Nobody? Yeah. It reinforces the sense that this is distant. Okay? This is happening at the poles. This is happening at high altitudes. It's not happening where we live. And by the way, most of those pictures of melting ice you see don't have any people in them. So there's no clear sense of why that's even important. Most people don't think about, oh, ice melting means sea levels are going to rise, which means more flooding and coastal erosion where I live. Most people don't make that connection. And what they really aren't making connections, the thing that we as scientists are most concerned about, is that as the ice melts, it's changing the reflectivity of the Earth itself. Ice reflects about 70-80% of the sunlight and the heat energy back to space. You remove it, and now only about 10% of that energy gets reflected back to space because water underneath, or land surface underneath, absorbs that energy. So melting of ice leads to additional warming, which causes more melting, which causes more warming, which causes more melting, which causes more warming, in a runaway spiral effect. Okay? It amplifies climate change. But most of us don't understand that. We also see a lot of people who, when they hear the word global warming, they just say rising temperatures. It's going to get warmer. And that's not necessarily seen as a really bad thing. We find a lot of people who continue to confuse global warming with ozone hole. Okay? That's a fascinating story. I don't have time to do it now. If someone wants to ask me about it in the Q&A, I'm happy to. But they are different problems. Different problems. Some people have apocalyptic images that come to mind, things like death of the planet, all life dead, like after nuclear war. These are images that often go way beyond even the worst case scientific scenarios. Flooding, changing climates, impacts on non-human nature, not people. And then last but not least are the naysayers. Okay? And there are many different species of naysayers. There are those who just simply say it's not happening. And then there are those that say, well, it could be happening, but it's not proven yet. And then there are those that doubt based on their own personal experience. I mean, come on, we just had a big snowstorm. There can't be global warming, Then there are those that blame it on media or environmentalist hype. And then last but not least are those that we lovingly call the conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away American sovereignty, it's a get-rich scheme by Al Gore and his friends, and many, many, many other such narratives. Okay? Now, one other thing I want to say about this, because we've done this at least twice a year for many years now. In all the years that I've been using this particular technique, I've always been stunned in that nobody, one of the most important things that we find is what we don't find. Okay? Almost no one associates global warming with impacts on human health. Nobody says anything about asthma. Nobody says anything about allergies. Nobody says anything about infectious diseases. Nobody even says anything about all the human health consequences of extreme events. It's like we have health in one part of our brain and climate change in another part of the brain, and they've never connected the dots. And yet, when you look at what the impacts of climate change are likely to be, that's the thing that we ought to all be most concerned about, is what it's going to do not to polar bears, but to people. Okay, so like I said, this data is from 2003. Now I'm going to show you what this data looked like in 2010. Now, it probably doesn't take an advanced degree in statistics to see the big change. And that's right here. Okay? Those naysayer images dramatically increased. And about half of these now are those kind of conspiracy theory type responses. Okay. So what's going on? Why did we see such shifts in public engagement? Well, there are a lot of different factors. In some ways, we like to call it a perfect storm. We think we've identified what some of the most important ones are, but here's the broader context. First, the economy, the economy, the economy. 2008 is when the housing bubble pops, the financial crisis hits, unemployment surges up over 10%, and of course, Americans are really scared, as are people around the world. People are afraid of losing their job, losing their home, seeing foreclosure signs down the street, worried that we're going to head into a new depression. Okay? So for very obvious, clear reasons, people are very worried about the economy and unemployment, which soar to the top of public priorities where they've dwarfed the priorities list ever since. But what's less understood is what happened to media coverage. Now, media coverage is critical because it's by far the way that most Americans come to know about this issue. For the scientists in the room, I'm sorry to be the one that breaks it to you, but they don't know you. They don't read your papers. They don't read the IPCC reports. They really have no idea who you are or what you even do. In fact, it's been only about 1 in 200 Americans say that they know a scientist personally. And when asked to identify a living scientist, most people can't and say so. And those that try, some of the top choices are Albert Einstein and Charles Darwin. If only they were still alive. So it's not directly from the mouths of scientists. It's through the media. And if this room had windows in it, it doesn't, we could all look outside right now, and there is CO2 pouring out of tailpipes. There's CO2 pouring out of buildings. There's CO2 pouring out of smokestacks. There's CO2 coming out of your mouth and nose this very second. But until I said it, you weren't conscious of it because it's invisible. You see it? No. Okay? So we don't even recognize that we are literally surrounded by the causes, and yet we can't see them. If you could walk out, and I encourage you to do this, just take a moment of imagination the next time you go outside, because if you could see it in the middle of this city, you would see this gigantic plume billowing out of Los Angeles up into the sky. And there's another giant plume coming out of Las Vegas, and another one coming out of Phoenix, and another one coming out of Beijing, and another one out of Dusseldorf, and London, and Johannesburg. But we don't see it, and so it seems like it doesn't exist. And because most of us only know about it through the media coverage is critical. And what we found, my good friend and colleague Max Boykoff tracks newspaper coverage, it dropped 2/3 from 2007 to 2010. My colleague Bob Brule tracks nightly network news coverage, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News. It dropped 90%. And by the way, this isn't like global warming was in a whole lot of news stories in the first place. Our own research has found that even in 2007, which was the high water mark, global warming was mentioned in about 0.9% of total news coverage. Okay? That's not much. And I can tell you this, it was a lot lower than other critical stories of the time, like Balloon Boy. Do you remember Balloon Boy? That little hoax of this kid who supposedly floated away in a balloon. Michael Jackson's death, even several years after he had died, totally dwarfs the amount of coverage climate change ever got. By 2011, the last time we had data, that amount of coverage had dropped to 0.1%. Okay? So when the news media doesn't report this issue, it's literally out of sight and out of mind. It's not that people have completely forgotten it, it's just not salient. Unusual cold weather. This same time period had some massive snowstorms in the East Coast, and I always get them wrong. There was first Snowmageddon, and then there was Snowpocalypse. We're running out of all of these. And for some people will draw on their own recent experience of weather to make up their mind about global warming. And so when it snows out or it's cold, they go, well, that doesn't seem like global warming. And then other times when it's really hot, they go, oh, gosh, that does seem like global warming, so maybe it is real. Okay? Leaving out the global part of global warming. The denial industry, I don't have to talk about it. I've already mentioned that. ClimateGate happens in this time period. These emails that were stolen from climate scientists and then certain phrases cherry-picked out and completely taken out of context to imply that this was all a big scientific hoax. By the way, there have been 6 independent investigations of all of those emails, gone through line by line, and all of them have reached the same conclusion. There was absolutely nothing going on there, but it doesn't matter. The story had already been told. And then really what I think is most important, increasing political polarization. This is an issue, believe it or not, as late as 1997, Democrats and Republicans did not have diametrically different views on this issue. But in 97, Bill Clinton, who was a highly polarizing president, and Al Gore signed the Kyoto Protocol and tried to bring it back, which they never actually submitted to the Senate for ratification. The Kyoto Protocol, by the way, was an international treaty to try to reduce carbon emissions. And ever since then, the two parties have gotten farther and farther and farther and farther and farther apart until we now live in a world where climate change is one of the most divisive issues in politics. Where Democrats basically say, yes, it's real, it's serious, it's a major problem, and Republicans almost, well, not universally, it turns out, as we've done a fair amount of interesting work on, but have taken the line of that this is either a hoax or it's not something we need to be concerned with. Okay, though that, too, is changing right now. Okay, so why then the rebound since 2011? Well, in part, the economy and the unemployment have been improving. There has been increasing media coverage, especially in the past year. And one of the things that's been happening is that Americans suddenly experienced a whole series of record-setting weather events. Okay? And in fact, we have found that about 57% of Americans think that global warming is already affecting weather in the United States. Now, it's not as simple as people experience an extreme event, a flood, a fire, a drought, and suddenly they go, okay, now I got it, global warming is real. It's not that simple. But what they are beginning to do is ask questions. These are teachable moments. It's one of the rare times Americans are actually, their attention gets focused away from everyday concerns of going to work, feeding your family, getting your kids to school, taking care of your parents, et cetera, knowing who's up and who's down on American Idol, all the critical things of life, and thinking about something that has a direct connection to climate change. And what many people are beginning to see is not just the individual event, but the pattern. If something happens once, it's happenstance. That just happens. If something happens twice, okay, well, that's just a coincidence. If it happens 3 times, you're beginning to see a pattern. If it happens 4, 5, 10, 12, 17, 22, 24 times, record-setting event after record-setting event after record-setting event, many people start connecting those dots and saying, whoa, what is going on with the nation's weather? Could this have something to do with climate change? And so they're at least beginning to be open to a new conversation, which, by the way, also changes that earlier dynamic I talked about, how many Americans think of this as a distant problem. When you're suffering through, as you are, the worst drought in California's modern history, that's here and now. That's not a generation away, and that's not polar bears. That's right here. And so people are beginning to ask these questions. And in fact, many people are even beginning to say, yeah, I think climate change is impacting specific events, even when it is appropriate and sometimes when it's not appropriate, because the science here, it depends on the event. We're pretty clear about the relationship between climate change and heat waves. We're pretty clear about the relationship between climate change and droughts. We're not so clear yet about the relationship between climate change and tornadoes. But nonetheless, at least half of Americans are beginning to say, hey, I think climate change played a role in making some of these events worse. Okay. But I also want to just emphasize that there's actually a lot more agreement out there. For all the political division this issue gets, and you know what I'm talking about, there is actually a lot more consensus and agreement among Americans than many of us recognize for at least some of the policies that might be required. So for instance, first of all, Americans overwhelmingly support the idea of increasing funding for improvements to local roads, bridges, and buildings to make them more resistant to extreme weather. Okay? Democrats, Republicans, everybody understands that. And by the way, in our data, we find that 80% of Americans say that they have personally experienced one or more extreme weather events in the past year. And a third of them say that they've been personally harmed in some form or fashion by those events. This isn't just distant stuff. People are beginning to recognize that even in America, we are vulnerable. Our systems don't work. Where I live, I've been hit by Hurricane Irene, Hurricane Sandy, and super snowstorm Nemo, which literally my little town was the epicenter of. It was our 15 minutes of fame on the Weather Channel. We got more snow that year than anybody else. It was like up to here. Okay? I know this is really hard for you to compute. And I've been without power for 10 days. Okay? That's nothing. I didn't lose my home. I didn't lose anyone I loved. People on the East Coast have been hit far worse than I was. But I can tell you, 10 days without power, it sucks. Okay? And I'm in America. Imagine what it's like in most of the rest of the world. Funding more research into renewable energy sources. Everybody likes this. For all the years we've been asking this question, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, everybody likes the idea of making the transition to a 21st century energy system. It's hard to find people who say, you know what, I really love coal. I love it. Okay? I mean, think about that for a moment. We, in the 21st century, are still primarily reliant on an energy system that came about in the 1800s that is digging stuff up out of the ground, setting it on fire. Okay? Most people are like, let's get on with an energy system that represents the 21st century. Okay? And again, California has really been one of the great pioneers in this transition. Providing tax rebates for people who purchase energy-efficient vehicles or solar panels. Most people love this. Help me. Help me because I don't have the money up front to buy solar panels. So give me some incentives. Regulating carbon dioxide is a pollutant. This is the big fight that we're in the middle of right now. It's going to heat up a lot in the next couple months. This is what the Obama administration has directed the EPA to do, is to start regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. There's a big fight on this. And yet, again, most people say, yeah, if it's a pollutant, make them stop. And then requiring electric utilities to produce at least 20% of their electricity from renewable energy sources, even if it costs a household an extra $100 a year, most people say, yeah, okay, I could handle that. I'm willing to be part of the solution. Now, one of the other things that we've learned in our work, of course, is that the American public doesn't speak with a single voice on this issue. There are, in fact, different audiences. And one of the first rules of effective communication, of effective education, of, frankly, effective interaction with your friends and your family is know your audience. Who are they? What do they know? What don't they know? What emotions do they have? What are their motivations? What values do they have? Who do they trust? Where do they get their information? Okay? This is like marketing 101. And in our work, we've identified what we call global warming 6 Americas. The country is not divided into believers and deniers. That's way too simplistic. Instead, what we find is that the public is better understood as at least 6 key audiences ranged more or less on a spectrum, and here they are. The first is a group that we call the alarmed, and by the way, this data is just a few months old. That's about 13% of the public. They think climate change is happening, human-caused, it's serious, it's urgent, they strongly support policy, but many of them don't know what we can do. We as a community have done a far better job explaining the problem than we have the solutions. The next major group, nearly a third, is what we call the concerned. These are people who say, okay, yes, it's happening, it's human-caused, it's serious, but for many of them it's still distant. Again, distant in time, distant in space. So many of them say, yeah, I wish somebody would do something about it, but it's not a priority. I think this is probably one of those issues we can kind of stick it on the back burner, not knowing that the pot's boiling over on the back burner. Then a group we call the cautious, about a quarter of the country. These are people who are kind of on the fence. Is it real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it serious, or is it kind of overblown? They're paying attention, but just really haven't made up their mind yet. Then a group we call the disengaged, and these are people who've heard the term global warming, but they don't know anything about it. Over and over they say, I don't know what causes it. I don't know what the consequences are going to be. I certainly don't know what the solutions are. I just don't know. So it's basic awareness. That's their primary barrier. Then a group that we call the doubtful, and these are people who say, yeah, I don't think it's happening, but if it is, it's natural. Nothing we had anything to do with, nothing we can do anything about. I don't see it as much of a risk, and so I don't pay much attention. And then last but not least are those that we call the dismissive. Again, it's not happening, it's not human-caused, it's not a serious problem. And again, at least 3/4 of them are conspiracy theorists. Now note that that's only 13%. That's only 13%. But it's a really loud 13%. It's a really vocal 13%. It's a 13% that's very well funded and very well represented in the halls of Congress. And they, in fact, make themselves sound like they're half or more of the country. And we see this in lots of different places. And you've seen it yourself. Think about all the times that you've read an article online about climate change. And then you look at the comments, right? And you start reading through those comments, and half or more will be from people of this persuasion, saying, oh, it's all just a big hoax. Oh, it's just a big liberal plot. Oh, it's Al Gore, and blah, blah, blah. Okay? So it's really easy as a member of the public, as a journalist, as a policymaker, to come away with a false impression that it's half or more of the country. But it's not. It's only 13%. But they've intimidated many other people in the rest of the country into silence, into saying, I'm afraid to even talk about this because I'm afraid somebody's going to start yelling at me. Now, we've also, just as a way to try to understand how there are completely different conversations happening in this country at the exact same time. So one question we've asked Americans is, if you could ask an expert on global warming one question, what question would you ask? So the doubtful and dismissive down here, their main question is, so how do you know that global warming is happening or human caused? And on a deeper level, their real question is, why should I trust you? Whereas the groups in the middle are saying, okay, maybe it's real, but so what? Why should I care? Whereas these groups are saying, okay, I got it. It's happening. It's human caused. It's serious. But what do we do? What do we do? And what we're beginning to hear just a little bit, especially in this group, just a smidgen, is the question, is it too late? Okay? And that's a really dangerous attitude. Okay? To quote Henry Ford, those who think they can and those who think they can't are both right. Okay, so one major last point I'm going to make here, and this is about what we also clearly see, and that is the role of values. That much of the debate around climate change, the political discussion we're having, is ultimately rooted in conflicting views of society, in conflicting views or conflicting values. So what we've seen very clearly is that people who are alarmed have what we call a strong egalitarian worldview. These are people who say there's too much discrimination in our society, that the inequities of wealth, both within the United States and across countries, is a major source of conflict, that government should be trying to reduce poverty. Okay? All questions that have really nothing directly to do with climate change, and yet people who have that egalitarian worldview are the ones who are the most concerned about climate change. By contrast, the dismissive tend to have what we call a strong individualistic worldview. That for them, the preeminent value that trumps all others is individual liberty, individual freedom, individual autonomy, which often gets cast as anti-government. The government's too big, it's too intrusive, it's too much taxation, too much regulation. I mean, you know this set of themes very well. Of course, it's what you hear very strongly in the Tea Party movement and in the libertarian community as well. Okay? The sense that, that the government is always your enemy, not an essential part of society. So what do we see when you look at that? You look at policies like regulating CO2 as a pollutant, and these groups line up just like you would expect, with the alarmed, very worried about it, the dismissive, not at all. Opposing the policy. Same with a requirement of a 20% national renewable portfolio standard. The alarmed, all for it. The dismissive, don't like it at all. Okay? Because it's about government mandates. By contrast, everybody generally supports clean energy. Now, why is that? You know, this group's easy to understand. They support clean energy because it's clean, and it's going to reduce climate change. Why would the dismissive and the doubtful support clean energy? Because it resonates with their values. It's about independence, energy independence, okay? Self-reliance, one of the core American values, especially New England value. And in fact, one of the most interesting concrete examples of this is a very unusual partnership that happened just about 2 years ago in the state of Georgia. In the state of Georgia, there's a state monopoly, Georgia Power. It was pretty much the sole producer and distributor of electricity in the entire state. And this is Georgia. We're not talking about Massachusetts here, Georgia. This monopoly did not want any competition for electricity generation, okay? Because obviously they've got strong profit motives. So in this state of Georgia, the Sierra Club partnered with the Atlanta Tea Party. Let me say that again. The Sierra Club partnered with the Tea Party, okay, for the right of individual homeowners to install solar panels on their roof and transmit that power back into the grid, which the monopoly didn't want. I don't like competition. Those two groups found common cause in this policy. And lo and behold, they won. Okay? And in fact, they found other things that they can actually agree about and are working together to work on those as well. And this relationship has become so successful that they're now being called the Green Tea Party. Now, this is just to say that this is the art of politics, is that sometimes strange bedfellows can come together and support the exact same policy for completely different reasons. Why did the Sierra Club support solar on rooftops? Because they care about climate change. Why did the Tea Party support it? Because for them it's about individual liberty, individual choice, and self-reliance. Being able to own your own destiny and generate your own damn power. Okay? So there's actually, in many cases, more possibility out there than most of us can recognize because we get so stuck in our tribal identities. And basically that's what we see here as well. Okay. So just to quickly sum up, as I described, public understanding declined pretty substantially from 2008 to 2010, dramatically changing the national political climate of climate change. However, Americans are beginning to connect the dots between climate change and our daily lives. The things that we're experiencing, our businesses, our security, and you're about to see a whole new discussion about to emerge in just the next couple months of the moral dimension, because Pope Francis is about to release an encyclical where every indication is it's going to be very strong about saying that climate change is a fundamental moral and religious issue. Okay? That's a whole new discourse in America. This issue has been seen as a scientific debate, about polar bears and the environment, or about liberal politicians. And we're about to see a very different language and set of messengers enter into this fray. And I think that's going to be really, really interesting to watch. Again, there are very different Americas, and each one of them needs to be approached on their own terms. The facts are actively interpreted by these different audiences who are always constructing their understanding in accordance with what they already know or think they know, what their underlying values are, and especially the emotions, which we haven't talked about here, but emotions are deeply embedded in this issue, from anger and disgust and outrage to fear and sadness, and yes, lots of happiness and excitement too, for those of us that have started looking at the solutions. Knowledge is necessary, but it's usually insufficient. That emotions, values, ideology, and all these broader social, economic, and political forces are also playing critical and sometimes more important roles in shaping how we respond. And that it's really important that we at least come to understand some of the basic facts, such as that the experts, in fact, do agree about this. That climate change is going to have and is already having real impacts on our lives, not just polar bears and people in far-off countries. And critically, that, in fact, it is solvable. You can always come to our website and find any of our materials. We've made many of our public reports available. We also have a long peer-reviewed publication record. So I invite you to come visit. And I also ask you to come listen to Climate Connections. It's available on iTunes. It's also available on our website and hopefully on a radio station here. So thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for a great presentation. I think we have time for a couple of questions, and I mean questions. Short, concise, as much as we can make it. Comments afterward, outside, at the reception time, we can make all comments. So, anybody with a question?
Well, every aspect that you mentioned, like for example, all the carbon comes from our mouths.
Yeah.
It seems that everything is directly connected to the number of people. So is this, do you think, the main problem, the population, that there is no other way to solve if we don't reduce the population?
Okay. So the question is the ultimate source of all of this the size of the world population. And by the way, when I use the example of carbon dioxide coming out of your mouth, that is not a significant contribution to climate change. So keep breathing, okay? Keep breathing. Okay, so look, population matters, but population only matters in the context of the resources that population uses. So there's an old formula that impact equals population times affluence times technology, okay? That, look, India right now has over 1 billion people, most of whom are living on, $2 to $5 a day, 2/3 of whom still do not even have electricity, who are living subsistence lives, growing their own food in most cases, subject and vulnerable to the vagaries of the monsoon and weather. So you want a dangerous place, okay? That's a place where having done a fair amount of work there, I'm really worried about India and that whole Indian subcontinent. Their contribution to climate change is tiny compared to all of us here in the United States. The 300 million people here generate far more carbon dioxide per capita than anywhere else in the major countries. Okay? Why? Because of affluence. So population matters, yes it does, but affluence really matters. And the technology with which you generate that affluence, is it solar panels or is it coal-fired power plants, also makes a huge difference. So yes, but. So thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you.